Damn, it was hot. How could these humans stand to live in a place like this? The fierce desert heat assaulted Tove as he scampered from shadow to shadow. Even in the shade of the other buildings, the temperature seemed to radiate from all directions. Ever since he had been defeated, Tove had retreated to the desert city of Xathien, as it was the closest city beside the great river. The humans who had the last piece were on a ship, and they were headed in this direction. If they passed by the city, Tove would know about it. This city, Xathien, was called the Jewel of the Desert by the humans who lived here. A rain shadow had been cast upon the land, which meant the dry air swept down past the distant mountain range, leaving the area east of the mountains a dry and arid place. Xathien was the only city in the desert, with only a few oasis outposts scattered throughout the land as well. The people who called this home had become accustomed to the heat, or at any rate, they wore light, breathable clothing. Xathien was overcrowded, and the main streets were filled with people. Tove stuck to the alleys, for he was a smaller person and likely to be trampled by the inconsiderate humans. For the last couple of days, Tove rested in abandoned buildings, ate stolen food, and waited. Damn, if only he had been stronger. Then he could have been able to get the last piece, and then return home to the more comfortable climates where his village was located. Tove winced. Hopefully, Yurei would remain in the village as per his intended request. She was safe, and she wouldn't have to endure the aggravating tension of fighting that group of people. 3 of them had the power of the gods and goddesses, the Alicorni. One of them was a beastly Onistan, and the other was a fantastic swordswoman, although not as good as Tove. Fighting individually, he would have been able to take on any of them. Hell, fighting the mages alone, or the Onistan and the lady fighter alone, he would have been able to succeed. Next time, he would have to be more careful. A frontal assault would be just as ineffective as it had the first time. No, next time he would have to
Well, looky here, boys. A tiny little boy all alone in the middle of the alley. Where are your parents, boy?
Tove blinked alert, and he glanced all around. Damn, he was so lost in thought, he was not aware that a group of 4 large human men had collected around him. It didn't help that the heat was sweltering. 2 of the men blocked the alleyway leading to the closest street, while the other 2 blocked any escape deeper into the crevices between the buildings. Each of the humans had daggers stuffed between their belts, and they all gaped at him with hungry eyes.
Go away, or I promise you'll regret bothering me.
The large men glanced at one another, and then one of them started laughing hysterically. The others laughed a little too, but more akin to joining in the mirth of their friend, rather than truly understanding why he was laughing.
He talks like an adult man. What kind of a weird thing are you? You're tiny.
Maybe he's some kind of strange yokai. I wonder what we could get for selling him to Egot the Slaver.
You got any gold, little one? If you do, then we may not sell you as a slave.
One by one, the thugs all drew their daggers free, and they held them out in front of them, pointed toward Tove.
You had bet.
Tove extended his hand and fed magic into it. In an instant, his amber yellow-colored blade hummed to life. The eyes of the thugs widened and they froze in place. It was such an easy thing to disarm the thugs, as they were close in proximity, and they were all taller than Tove. He flourished his blade around him in swift right arcs, and his energy weapon sliced through flesh and bone. Tove twirled about and whipped his blade in a constant motion. Everything happened so fast that the thugs remained still until Tove finally stopped his sword. He held it beside him, and the thugs fell apart before him. They screamed, of course. Loud and horrid-sounding wails. Tove peeked down to the end of the alley where the street was, and people were already looking inside. He swung his sword defensively 4 more times, cutting each of the thugs' throats, faces, or skulls. Dead men could not reveal the presence of the Vren. Someone had started to move down the alley. Damn! Tove ran into the alleyway, turned a corner, and then summoned his wings. No human was in sight, and so he flew up to the roof of the adjacent building. As soon as he was there, he dismissed his wings, and then crept over to the side, overlooking where he devastated his would-be harassers. 3 new humans stood over the 4, and they rustled through the belongings of the dead, taking gold, weapons, and even undamaged clothing. Tove sighed as he rolled back around the corner. Humans were such despicable creatures. The sun beat down upon him with even more fury, as there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and there wasn't any shade to protect from its wrath. Tove gave a quick look to the river. There wasn't a sailing ship in sight, and he couldn't feel the presence of the last Sparkle Starlock yet. Surely they would come this way, right? Tove summoned his wings, and he flew low just over the roofs of the buildings. He chose an opposite direction and finally landed on a roof towards the western part of the town. There wasn't anyone in the alleys below him, so Tove leapt down and took much-needed shelter in the shade once more. A wild sense of urgency danced in his chest, and Tove moved to the edge of the alleyway. There was still time to wait, and he was getting hungry. Rayko stepped out onto the deck of the ship, a slight sense of weariness still clinging to her. While the hammocks provided weren't all that unpleasant, they certainly weren't the lovely beds she had become used to back in Jedi. The day was clear, and a strong wind blew toward the east, which was great as Xianba was toward the east. When Rayko gazed beyond the confines of the ship, a small degree of awe came over her. Sometime during the night they emerged from the domain of the mountains, and a vast desert covered the landscape to the left of the ship, while a less dry but still fairly arid sort of plains existed past the right bank of the river. Nori and Apisa stood just right of the central mast, leaning on the railing. Though they were talking to one another, they both passively stared at another pair, conversing toward the front of the vessel. Rayko followed their line of sight. Flara and the new addition to their little group, Alfana Vihori, spoke in moderate tones. She couldn't hear Flara's soft voice, but she did hear the pirate prince, ever so slightly. Usually, whenever Flara spoke to new people, her mannerisms were more demure, and she often averted her eyes continuously. With Vihori, it was different. Flara maintained constant eye contact, and by Saito's grace, the warmth of her smile sent nurturing vibrations into Rayko's core. Rayko approached Apisa and Nori.
She looks rather content, does she not?
I know, right? I can't believe it. Our little Flora is all grown up.
I am certainly glad they have strong connections. I would have hated for Flara to have been burdened with a poor match.
So, I've actually been wondering, what do you all think about this marriage thing?
We just want Flora to be happy. The 3 of us had tea and talked about it.
Yes, we talked about a couple things, did we not? But yes, we consulted Flara's feelings on the matter, and she expressed how important this political marriage could be for the survival of the Empire. Oh, I certainly hope that war does not blossom in the future.
I hope that as well.
So, if they get married, will you have to protect both of them? Since he would then become a part of the royal family?
I suppose I would, if I was still assigned to watch over Flara.
What do you mean, still assigned? I just assumed that you were going to be Flara's lifetime protector.
No, being a Chutar doesn't work that way. I could just as easily be reassigned when we get back to Xianba, considering the potential devastation that might come in the wake of this Vren's efforts. I'll be honest, I don't relish the idea of not being around you all. I've endured through so much, and I rather like you all.
We like you very much, too.
Yes, we do. When we first started this experience, I saw you as nothing more than a burden for our dear friend. However, it is as you have said. We have endured so much together, and I am delighted to call you friend.
I feel the same way, and so does Flara.
Oh, that's actually quite endearing. Thank you. It's been a long time since I've had an actual friend.
Well, you can count me in that group as well. I enjoy your company very much, Onistan.
Luxie walked down from the top platform where the rudder was. A wide smile creased her face, and she pointed to a spot on the horizon.
Look there, the jewel of the desert, Saucy.
Rayko looked in the direction where Luxie had been pointing. A small city sat along the edge of the river on the desert bank. Several ships were all docked in the harbor, and there weren't any other ships or vessels sailing about. That made sense considering that the Great Kappa Migration was still in effect, or at the very least coming to a close.
We're gonna stop there for the night to unload some of the smuggled cargo we had been transporting. Thanks to you all, our client gets to have their shipment early. Also, if memory serves, this should be during the Festival of the Dead. Tonight will be the Parade of Lanterns. You all celebrate that, right?
Yeah, we do. I always carry a lantern for my parents. They died when I was a little kid from a nasty disease that ravaged Buka.
As do I. For the last couple of years, I carry a lantern for my beloved little sister Senna.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear about your parents, Apisa. And about your sister, Rayko.
It could have been an easy thing for Rayko to move the conversation on, and yet something tugged at her so fiercely that she had to comply. She swallowed hard, and then looked directly into Nori's eyes. It caught the man off guard, so he leaned back and frowned at her.
Are you okay, Rayko?
Yes, darling. I am, I suppose. There's something I want to tell you about my sister.
Are you sure, Rayko?
Yes, I am. After all, we just committed ourselves by calling him friend, and this is something he should know. It will make my earlier interactions with him more understandable, I'm sure. Nori, my sister, my dear, sweet little sister Senna, was killed 2 years ago by a band of ruthless Onistan pirates.
Nori's eyes widened, and he kept gaping at her. Luxie averted her eyes, and she let out a slight, sympathetic sort of scoff.
Let me guess. It was the Crimson Skull Pirates.
Yes, I am afraid it was. After it happened, I swore that I would never forgive them, or any Onistan, for the murder of my sister. You see, she was a young girl who was studying in a merchant financing apprentice program. Her ship was attacked by those brutes, and there were no known survivors. That is why I was so cruel to you in the beginning, and I am so sorry.
Nori wrapped his large arms around Rayko's much smaller body. His body warmth blasted into her like a summer day.
I'm so sorry for the crimes of my people. I'm sorry for your sister's loss, and also, you don't have to apologize for anything, okay? All is forgiven, and all is forgotten.
Nori stepped away, and Rayko wiped her tear-stained face on her sleeve.
You are quite wonderful, darling. Oh, so wonderful. Do they celebrate the Parade of Lanterns in Onista? All the places that I know who celebrate the ritual are by rivers.
As a matter of fact, we don't actually celebrate it. But we do have a similar sort of ritual, though. Every year on the last night of the year, each and every Onistan household sets out a special white candle in the street in front of their houses. All other lights are put out until morning. The candles give the city an otherworldly glow. It allows the spirits of past Onistans to walk about, seeing their families.
Wow, that's really interesting. Hey, did you or your family ever set out the white candles?
Excuse me?
Well, you know, since your father was an Easton.
Wait, what?
How did you know about that? I never told any of you. Not even Nori about that.
That is not a problem that we know, is it? Your mother told us when she had late-night tea with Pite Apisa and I.
It's not a problem, I just didn't realize that my mother told you that.
So your father really was an Onistan?
Yes?
Not that it matters, I guess, but why didn't you tell me? Were you ashamed of your heritage?
What? No, of course not. I didn't want you getting the wrong idea about my father. He was an outcast from Onista. And well, that comes with a lot of stigma. But my father was an honorable man who took the blame for a friend, and he left Onista instead. Still,
You don't have to explain. I get it. I'm sorry that your father was forced to leave Onista, but on the other hand, had he not left, I suppose there wouldn't have been a you.
I'll tell you about it someday. Have any of you ever been to Saucy?
Rayko, Nori, and Apisa all shook their heads.
That's what I thought. It's an interesting city, populated with more than a few hundred people who have sticky fingers, if you catch my drift. Most of the people who live here are nice, though. Even the thieves. I'll let the others know we're going to stop here to port. Once we dock, I'll have one of my men run up to one of the temples and request lanterns for all of us. Are you going to be carrying one, Nori?
I started walking in the March of the Lanterns about 5 years ago, since Xathien celebrates it. None of my family or Onistans that I know have passed on to my knowledge, and so I always carried it for a kind older woman who often gave me sweets and bread. She operated a hole-in-the-wall bakery in Xathien.
That is really sweet of you to honor someone like that. It's even more splendid that someone else saw the radiant soul inside you, behind the large visage of the Onistan.
Right. If you'll excuse me, I'll go do captain stuff now.
Luxie moved back to where the rudder was, while Apisa asked Nori another question about Onista. Rayko tuned them out, and she turned her attention to the approaching city. To be honest, she wasn't really seeing the city itself, but instead, Rayko peered back into her memory. It was that time again, to honor her sweet baby sister Senna. When they first arrived in Saucy, the streets were bustling with people, and it was actually quite hard to move around, especially for Nori. However, as soon as the March of Lanterns began, the streets seemed to empty, save for the set of double lines running up the main avenue in Saucy. One line of people moved toward the great temple of Saito, which was in the center of the city. The other line had started to slowly march down the other end of the street, and each of the people who walked in the second line had paper lanterns in their grasp. No one smiled, and for the most part, people moved forward with their eyes downcast. They walked casually and purposely, not rushing the person in front of them, nor hindering the person behind them. The head of the lantern line was one of the senior monks of the shrine, and she wore elaborate robes and a headdress that designated her as a member of her station. She set the pace, and no one else balked at it. Nori was still in the line to get the lanterns, and he walked between Apisa and Rayko. Flara was in front of Rayko, and Vihori was in front of her. Luxie was in front of Vihori. As per tradition, Nori didn't carry any weapons, for such a thing would have been sacrilege, even for a Chutar. Several city guards stood at various places along the route, and they watched the procession with sad, solemn eyes. To their perspective and hope, no one would dare cause trouble during the March of the Lanterns. Acid bubbled in Nori's stomach, for now would be the perfect time for the Vren to strike. He batted the notion away, though, for even if that was the case, there was nothing he could do about it, other than fistfight the little bastard. As he was the only Onistan in sight, he easily towered over the lowlanders. To his great relief, though, no one made note of his height or his heritage. Nori peeked at Flara just to ensure that she was safe. Who was the princess walking for? As far as Nori knew, the Empress never had a partner. At least not one in sight. Could the man have died? Nori had a good guess as for who Luxie marched for, and perhaps the same could be said for Vihori. The fact that they were both half Onistan, well, Saito brought unexpected surprises in life. Nori's attention fell to Rayko, and he frowned deeper. All of her frustration and alienation towards him made sense, considering that her beloved little sister had been the unfortunate victim to the worst group of Onistans that had ever been produced. Even while training in Xianba, he had heard of the infamous exploits of the Crimson Skull pirates. Rather than turn around to Apisa, Nori let his gaze fall over the silent city that surrounded the procession. Even at night, South Sea still burned with an intense heat that made Nori's skin itch. The buildings were mostly 1 or 2 stories tall and made from clay bricks, wood, and stone. All of the roofs of the buildings were flat, which was quite strange. Then again, if there wasn't a lot of rainfall in the area, perhaps slanted roofs were unneeded. The whole city was built on a grid system, with streets intersecting one another every few hundred feet. Smaller alleyways ran between the buildings, where shadows dominated. Each of the streets were wide enough to accommodate 2 wagons side by side, which meant for easier foot traffic. All in all, South Sea was a well-planned small city. Nori and the others slowly marched up the middle of the city until they came to the great temple itself. Both of the lines passed through the large gateway, which was usually standard for Saito temples. A steep staircase led up to the raised area where the actual temple was placed. The layout of the temple consisted of several large buildings surrounding a large brass bell with a gazebo. Behind the gazebo stood the actual Saito shrine, where the gigantic golden statue of Saito was kept. A long 2-story rectangular building was to the right of the gazebo, which was most likely where the monks and temple caretakers lived. To the left of the gazebo was a large 1-story storage building of some kind. The doors to the shrine were opened, and so Saito watched the crowd as they approached. The brass bell had been carved and etched with the imagery of Saito as he went on his epic journey across the Korean continent, long before it was an empire. Each of the people in line took their turn to stand before the brass bell, and they placed their hands together, closed their eyes, and bowed before the bell. A long table had been set up, and piles of lanterns had been gathered behind it. One of the shrine maidens stood behind the table, and she handed unlit lanterns to each of the people who passed by. Another shrine maiden had a means of lighting the lanterns, and she illuminated people's lanterns as they passed by. Once individuals got their lanterns lit, they began the actual March of the Lanterns, back through the city and down to the river. Nori was given his lantern, and to his relief, none of the shrine maidens reacted to him differently than they would have a lowlander. Nori walked back through the city silent as those around him. Everyone in front of him had their eyes downcast, and they were no doubt lost in thought. Nori did the same, and he let his mind wander. Yes, he still carried the lantern for the kind old woman, whose name was Hagalu Iduiyu. She owned and operated a hole-in-the-wall bakery, which served as Nori's only refuge from the racism and isolation that Xianba offered him. She had always been kind to him, and didn't care if he was an Onistan. After she died, the bakery went to her son and his wife, who were far less kind to him, but they still allowed him to visit and partake of their establishment. However, going to that bakery was no longer nurturing. Another thought lingered in Nori's mind. It had been some time since he had received a letter from his mother back in Onista. Letters were so few and far between, as it was unlikely for someone to venture from Xianba to Onista and back again. A lump formed in the back of Nori's throat. Was she still alive? Were his brother and father? And what of his friends he had to leave behind? And what of the little girl? In that moment, Nori had made a decision, one that he hoped Iduiyu would understand and forgive him for. On this March of the Lanterns, and everyone going forward, unless something drastic changed, he wouldn't carry the lantern for someone else, but for the life Nori should have had, the life that was lost to him. That Nori would have stayed in Onista and grown up among other Onistans who understood and loved him for who he was. That Nori would have fallen in love with a farmer's daughter, and he would have spent his time between serving in the city militia with his mother and working the family farm with his new family and his wife. Nori and his wife would have had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and they would go on to have many children of their own. Old age would catch up with Nori eventually, and he would spend his golden years alongside his wife, playing her sweet Onistan ballads on his aged lute. That Nori would have been far from secret and long-forgotten war plans, constant hate from lowlanders, and inescapable obligation. Tears formed in Nori's eyes, but he blinked them away.
I carry this lantern for you, Nori, for the life you never got to lead.
To Nori's great horror, Rayko turned her head ever so slightly, and the corner of her eye met with his. She turned back a moment later but didn't say anything. The procession led to the harbor and toward one of the shores of the river. Each of those who marched placed their lanterns on the surface of the river. They said a little silent prayer, and then they moved back towards the city, choosing routes that would not hinder the path of the procession for others. The surface of the river sparkled like the stars above as hundreds of lights glimmered softly. The river moved with constant speed and it carried the lanterns to the east. Nori placed his lantern on the surface of the river, and he watched it float along with the others. He only lingered for a moment, and then he moved off to where Luxie, Vihori, Flara, and Rayko already stood. When Nori approached the group, Rayko walked up to him and hugged him tightly.
What's this for?
I heard you. I am sorry for your loss as well.
Nori simply smiled at her, and he hugged her back.
All things considered, I'm grateful to be here with you all.
We are the lucky ones, darling.
If you're passing out hugs, then I want one too.
Nori smiled, and then he gave Apisa a great big embrace as well. Having her arms around him as well it felt nice. Luxie, Vihori, and Flara all watched from the side, and they all smiled.
Okay, if you're all done being touchy-feely, Vihori and I talked it over and we're gonna rent us all rooms to sleep in. Girls will get 2 rooms and Vihori and Nori can share. We'll set sail for Xianba tomorrow. Any questions or concerns?
No one had anything else to say, so Nori followed the others back to the city. He gave one last fleeting look to the lantern-covered river. While it was true that he had lost out on a peaceful life, Nori was needed by his friends, especially in the coming days when war would ravage the land. All things considered, this life would be the better one. Tove crouched lower on the flat roof of one of the buildings. His eyes scanned the long pair of lines of people moving up and down the city. Somewhere in that crowd, the last piece of the Sparkle Star Lock existed, no doubt carried by the person who knew about his people. That human would also no doubt be surrounded by her powerful allies as well. He was so close, and yet he could... Tove's eyes fell on an interesting spectacle. One person towered over all of the other humans who walked in line. As soon as Tove noticed the Onistan, the other people surrounding him stood out as well. 2 of the mage women stood on either side of him, while the last one stood in front of the brown-haired mage. Tove's heart skidded to a slight halt before beating harder again. The man that stood in front of the know-it-all human mage was quite familiar. The longer that he looked at the taller human male, the more he knew for sure. That man had been in Gahoda. A small flicker of hope danced inside him, and yet Tove batted it away. In accordance to the human tradition of the March of the Lanterns, none of the humans in the procession had weapons. Those who surrounded the Sparkle Star Lock were unarmed, and yet Tove dare not slip out and cause chaos. A sudden idea came to mind, though, and so Tove slipped back away from the edge of the building, where the shadows concealed him. Tove summoned his wings, and then he soared low along the tops of the buildings, until he came to the harbor. Tove kept to the top of the roofs, and he studied each of the ships. It only took a few minutes to find the ship he thirsted for. The vessel with a large white sail and 2 black sails was towards the end of the dock. Even from this distance, Tove saw the half-dozen sailors on board. They were alert and cautious, which made sense considering the ruckus that Tove had caused them before. The sailors watched the harbor and they watched the sea, so approaching from either side would be fruitless. Tove licked his lips and he watched frantically. He had to do something, because the humans who marched in the line would only be distracted for so long. His eyes drifted upward and another idea brewed to life. Tove ran along the roofs away from the harbor, and he summoned his wings as well as his sword. Tove dug his blade into the roof, carving out a small hunk of material. It was a hand-sized rock, for all its intents and purposes. Tove dismissed his sword and then flew up into the sky, high and fast. Tove shifted in the air and he moved over where the ship was located. This had to work, for it was the only thing he could think of. Tove dismissed his wings and then he plummeted downward. Every 5 seconds or so, he summoned his wings momentarily and righted his trajectory, as well as controlling his descent. He dismissed his wings again so that they would not catch the eye of those below. Tove performed this cycle over and over until he was close enough to glide to the top of the ship's mast. Tove dismissed his wings, and then he slowly crawled down the mast. None of the sailors had noticed him, and so Tove got lower and closer to the ship itself. The moisture in his mouth faded from existence, and he slid his dry tongue against the interior of his mouth. The sailors still watched the area with alertness, and so any further movement would result in his discovery. Tove tossed the rock chunk, and moments later it splashed into the water of the harbor. All of the sailors turned their attention to where the sound came from, and they moved over to the railing.
What in Saito's name was that?
I don't see anything!
Tove clenched his gut and he dropped down into the stairwell. No one saw him, and thank the elders none of the sailors were in the hallway either. Tove quietly ran the length of the ship, and he came to the cargo hold at the back of the ship. Most of the space was empty with the exception of 3 very large crates and a couple of barrels. Tove ran over to the large boxes and moved one of them ever so slightly. With each motion he kept glancing over his shoulder, hoping no one would hear. As soon as there was a little space, Tove slid the barrels in front of the newly revealed space of the box, as if to hide the previously unexposed section. Tove crawled to the top of the box and then slid behind it, where he had created space. Because he was smaller in stature and dimension than a normal human, he didn't need a lot of space to be comfortable. Tove settled himself in that little space, and then he started to breathe a little easier. While the Sparkle Star lock wasn't on the ship now, it would hopefully return soon. Tove would be ready to strike when the humans returned.